I stood in my graduation gown, the heavy fabric clinging to my shoulders under the bright Boston sun, when my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and stared at the screen. It was a text from my father. "Don't expect any help. You're on your own, boy." I looked up and saw him sitting in the third row of the audience. His arms were tightly crossed over his chest, his jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line. He was glaring at me with a look of absolute disgust. He thought he had finally won. He thought I was a broken man, moments away from crawling back to him on my knees to beg for a job. But he had no idea about the second phone call that was about to come through. The call that would turn his arrogant pride to ash and leave him speechless in front of thousands of people. Before I tell you how a rejected son destroyed his father's golden empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning of my graduation from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology should have been a moment of pure triumph. The campus was alive with energy. Families were taking photos by the Great Dome, students were laughing, and the smell of freshly cut grass mixed with the expensive perfume of proud parents. I stood near the edge of the assembly area, adjusting the black tassel on my cap. My hands were perfectly steady. I wasn't nervous about walking across the stage. I was waiting for a completely different kind of confirmation. My father, Robert Anderson, had arrived 20 minutes earlier with my mother, Eleanor, and my two older brothers, Carter and Wyatt. They didn't come to celebrate me. They came out of a grim sense of family obligation, treating the event like a tedious chore. When I walked over to greet them, my father didn't offer a handshake or a smile. He just looked at my black gown, let out a short, dismissive breath through his nose, and checked his luxury watch. My brothers stood slightly behind him, wearing tailored suits bought with his money, smirking as if I were wearing a clown costume. Only my mother gave me a quick, nervous hug, her eyes darting toward my father to make sure he didn't disapprove of the gesture. I excused myself and walked back to the line of graduating seniors. That was when the phone buzzed against my thigh. I slipped it out of my pocket, hiding it under the wide sleeve of my gown. The screen lit up with the message. "Don't expect any help. You're on your own, boy." I stared at the words. They were cold, sharp, and brutally final. For a brief second, the loud chatter of the crowd around me faded into a dull roar. The air felt thick. He had chosen today, this exact moment, to deliver his ultimate rejection. He wanted to make sure that as I received my diploma, I knew I had no safety net, no family backing, and no future in his eyes. He wanted me to feel small. I locked the screen and slid the phone back into my pocket. I didn't cry. I didn't feel the crushing weight of sorrow that he probably hoped I would feel. Instead, a strange, profound calmness washed over me. The final string tying me to his expectations had just been severed. I looked over the sea of folding chairs and found him in the crowd. He was staring right at me, waiting for my reaction. I squared my shoulders, raised my chin, and gave him a slow, deliberate nod. He frowned, clearly confused by my lack of despair. He didn't know that hidden inside the breast pocket of my suit, underneath the graduation gown, was a second phone, a secure company line. He didn't know that while he was busy cutting me off, my executive team was sitting in a high-security boardroom in downtown Boston, waiting for the opening bell of the stock market. To understand why my father sent that text, and why my CFO was about to make a phone call that would shatter my family's reality forever, you have to understand where I came from. You have to understand the 20 years of relentless pressure, the brutal favoritism, and the suffocating environment that forced me to build a billion-dollar fortress just to survive. My father thought my little tech project was a joke. He was about to find out that the joke was entirely on him. I grew up in a house built on concrete, steel, and toxic expectations. My father, Robert, owned one of the largest construction and building supply companies in the state. He was a self-made man, massive in physical stature, with hands like leather and a voice that could shake the walls. In his world, a man's worth was measured by how much weight he could carry, how loud he could shout, and how easily he could command a room full of rough contractors. I was never that kind of man. Even as a child, I was quiet, observant, and physically slight. I preferred the logic of numbers and the silent hum of a computer processor over the chaotic noise of a construction site. This made me a profound disappointment to him from the very beginning. My older brother, Carter, was the golden child. He was exactly what my father wanted. Loud, athletic, and completely lacking in intellectual curiosity. By the time Carter was 12, my father was already bringing him to the job sites, putting a hard hat on his head, and telling the foreman, "Take a good look, this kid is your future boss." Carter was being actively groomed for his inheritance, trained to take over the empire. I remember a specific Tuesday afternoon when I was 8 years old. I had spent 3 weeks reading a thick manual I found at the local library and had managed to write a very basic, crude piece of code on our family's bulky desktop computer. It was a simple calculator program, but to me it was magic. I had created something out of nothing. I proudly printed the lines of code on 3 sheets of paper, stapled them together, and ran out to the driveway just as my father's heavy truck pulled in. He stepped out, smelling of diesel fuel and cheap cigars. Carter was right behind him, carrying a clipboard. I ran up and held out my stapled papers. "Dad, look, I made a program. It does math automatically. You could use it for the inventory." My father stopped and looked down at me. He didn't take the papers. He just stared at the lines of text. Then he let out a loud, barking laugh. He snatched the papers from my hand, crumpled them into a tight ball, and tossed them into the metal garbage can by the garage door. "Video games and typing won't put food on the table, Elijah," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Real men build things with their hands. They deal with concrete, not imaginary numbers. Don't embarrass this family with this useless garbage." He walked past me, placing a heavy hand on Carter's shoulder. Carter turned back and shot me a mocking grin before following our father inside. I stood in the driveway alone, staring at the garbage can. The smell of the trash mixed with the exhaust fumes of the truck burned in my nose. Later that evening, my mother, Eleanor, came into my room. She was a gentle woman, but entirely terrified of my father's temper. She sat on the edge of my bed and smoothed my hair. "You have to be practical, Elijah," she whispered, looking nervously at the bedroom door. "Your father works hard. He just wants you to be strong. Keep your little hobbies to yourself. Don't make him angry. Just blend in." She meant well, but her words were a betrayal. She was telling me to erase myself to keep the peace. From that day on, I learned to hide. I learned that my passion was considered a weakness, a defect in my character. I retreated into the digital world, where the rules made sense, where logic reigned supreme, and where a man's physical size meant absolutely nothing. I didn't know it then, but every time my father dismissed me, he was handing me the exact tools I needed to destroy his legacy. The true depth of my father's favoritism became undeniable on my 16th birthday. In the Anderson household, turning 16 was supposed to be a milestone, a rite of passage into manhood. When Carter turned 16 2 years earlier, my father had thrown a massive party and presented him with the keys to a brand new, midnight blue Porsche 911. It was an absurd car for a teenager, a screaming symbol of wealth and privilege. Carter crashed it into a mailbox 3 weeks later, and my father simply laughed it off and bought him a new bumper. When my 16th birthday arrived, there was no party. My father had a business dinner, and my mother had made a simple roast chicken. After dinner, my father walked into the kitchen, holding a plain brown cardboard box. He set it on the granite counter with a heavy thud. "Happy birthday," he said, not making eye contact. I opened the box. Inside was a laptop. It wasn't new. The edges were scuffed. The keys were shiny from years of use, and there was a faded corporate asset sticker on the bottom. It was a refurbished, outdated machine, likely something his IT department at the construction firm was throwing away. "Since you like pressing buttons so much, I figured this would keep you out of trouble," he said, taking a sip of his scotch. "It's good enough for typing up school reports. Don't expect any more handouts." My second older brother, Wyatt, walked into the kitchen at that exact moment. Wyatt was the quiet manipulator of the family. He didn't have Carter's muscles, but he knew exactly how to agree with my father to stay in his good graces. Wyatt looked at the thick, heavy laptop and snickered. "Careful, Elijah. Don't strain your wrists carrying that thing around. It looks like a brick." My father chuckled at the joke. I looked from the scratched laptop to the window, where Carter's pristine Porsche was parked in the driveway, gleaming under the security lights. The contrast was physically sickening. Felt like a funeral. It was the day the last remaining shred of my childhood died, along with any lingering hope that my father would ever love me equally. I didn't argue. I didn't throw a tantrum. I just quietly picked up the heavy laptop, tucked it under my arm, and said, "Thank you, sir." I walked up the stairs to my room, locked the door, and set the machine on my desk. I plugged it in and booted it up. The fan whirred loudly, sounding like a dying engine, but the screen flickered to life. As I looked at the glowing command prompt, the anger in my chest began to solidify into something cold and sharp. They thought this was a joke. They thought giving me a piece of trash was a way to keep me in my place. But they didn't understand the power of what they had just handed me. I didn't need a Porsche. A car could only take you down a road that someone else had already paved. But with a computer, I could build my own roads. I could build entire cities. I sat in the dark that night, the blue light of the screen illuminating my face, and I began to type. I started writing the foundational code for an encrypted communication protocol. It was clumsy at first, full of errors, but I worked relentlessly. Every time I heard the roar of Carter's sports car leaving the driveway, I typed faster. Every time Wyatt made a snide comment at breakfast, I buried myself deeper into the architecture of my software. The refurbished laptop became my weapon, and I was quietly, patiently sharpening the blade. By the time I was 18, my skills had outgrown the refurbished laptop. I had spent thousands of hours teaching myself advanced cryptography, building firewalls, and understanding network vulnerabilities. While my classmates were going to football games and prom, I was exploring the deep web, learning how data moved, how it was protected, and how it was stolen. When it came time for college applications, the expectation in the house was clear. I was to attend the local state university, get a mediocre business degree like Carter, and return to work in the shadow of my family's company. My father had already mapped it out. Carter would be the CEO, Wyatt would handle operations, and I would be shoved into a back office, managing the IT network for their construction sites. I never submitted the application to the state school. Instead, I secretly applied to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. When the thick acceptance envelope arrived in the mail, I intercepted it before anyone else could see it. I held it in my hands, feeling the embossed seal. It was my ticket out, but I knew the confrontation it would cause. I waited until dinner that night. We were sitting around the long mahogany dining table. Carter was talking loudly about a golf game, and my father was nodding approvingly. I reached into my bag, pulled out the acceptance letter, and slid it across the table toward my father. He stopped talking, annoyed by the interruption. He picked up the letter, adjusted his glasses, and read it. The silence in the dining room grew heavy. His face slowly turned a dark shade of red, the veins in his thick neck bulging. He slammed his fist onto the table, making the silverware jump. "What the hell is this, Elijah?" "It's an acceptance letter to MIT," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "The top engineering program in the country. I start in the fall." "No, you don't," he growled. "You are going to the state business school. I'm not paying a dime for you to go play with computers in Boston. Engineering is a waste of time. It's for geeks who don't know how to run a real business." "I have a partial scholarship," I replied, "but I need you to cover the rest of the tuition." Carter laughed out loud, leaning back in his chair. "MIT? You? Come on, man. You'll fail out in the first month. Just give it up." My father stood up, towering over the table. "I have a college fund set aside for you, Elijah, but it comes with conditions. You go where I say, you study what I say. If you go to Boston, that fund is gone. Zero. You hear me?" My mother looked down at her plate, her hands trembling. She wouldn't look at me. She was too scared to speak up. "I'm going," I said quietly. My father scoffed, a vicious, ugly sound. "Fine. I'll pay for the first year. 1 year. When you fail out, when you realize you can't hack it in the real world, you're gonna come crawling back here. And when you do, your college fund is gone, and the only job waiting for you is sitting at the receptionist desk at the supply yard, answering phones for Carter. Do we have a deal?" He wanted to break my spirit. He was betting everything on my failure, convinced that I was too weak to survive without his guidance. "We have a deal," I said. That night, I packed my bags in the dead of silence. I didn't take much. Clothes, a few books, and the laptop. As I carried my duffel bag down the hallway, Wyatt stepped out of his room. He leaned against the doorframe, a mocking smile on his face. "Have a good trip, little brother. Try not to embarrass us too much before you drop out." I didn't answer him. I walked out the front door, into the cold night air, and didn't look back. The clock was ticking. I had 1 year to make sure I never had to return to this house again. The transition to MIT was like stepping onto another planet. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who spoke my language. But the reality of my financial situation hit me immediately. The partial scholarship and my father's reluctant contribution barely covered tuition and a tiny, cinder-block dorm room. It left absolutely nothing for food, books, or living expenses. I was fighting a war of survival. I took a full course load of the hardest computer science classes available, and to keep myself fed, I took a job at the campus IT help desk working 20 hours a week. My life became a punishing routine. I woke up at 5 a.m., studied, went to class, worked my shift fixing broken laptops for rich kids, and then returned to my dorm to write code until 2 a.m. I lived on 4 hours of sleep and cheap instant ramen. I was exhausted, dangerously thin, and constantly running on caffeine and sheer willpower. But I wasn't suffering. For the first time, I felt alive. My roommate was a guy named Matthew. He was brilliant, messy, and shared my obsession with cybersecurity. We hit it off instantly. While other students were at frat parties, Matthew and I were sitting on the floor of our dorm room, eating cold pizza and debating the flaws in standard enterprise encryption models. The turning point came during a high-level algorithm seminar taught by Professor David, a legend in the cybersecurity field. For our midterm project, I submitted a theoretical framework for a dynamic encryption key system, a concept I had been developing since high school on that old refurbished laptop. Professor David asked me to stay after class. I stood by his desk, my backpack heavy on my shoulders, exhausted to the bone. He looked at my paper, then looked at me over his glasses. "Elijah, did you write this entirely by yourself?" he asked. "Yes, sir," I replied, suddenly nervous. He tapped his pen against the paper. "Do you realize the commercial applications of this? Standard financial institutions are using static models that are 5 years out of date. If you can actually build this protocol, you could revolutionize enterprise data security." My heart pounded in my chest. "I've started building it. My roommate Matthew and I are working on a prototype." "Finish it," he said firmly. "There's an annual startup competition on campus next month. The prize is $50,000 in seed funding. Enter the competition." I threw myself into the work with a manic intensity. Matthew and I barely slept for 3 weeks. We coded until our fingers ached and our eyes blurred. We were building something beautiful, an unbreakable vault for digital information. Every Sunday night, right at 8 p.m., my father would call my cheap prepaid cell phone. It was never to ask how I was doing. It was a tactical check-in designed to see if I was ready to quit. "How are the grades, boy?" His loud voice would boom through the tiny speaker. "The math getting too hard for you yet? Carter just closed his first supply deal today. Real money." "I'm fine, Dad. Classes are good," I would reply, staring at lines of complex code on my monitor. "Don't lie to me. I know you're working some minimum wage tech job. When you're ready to come home and take that receptionist desk, let me know. I won't hold it against you for failing." He would hang up, leaving me with the dial tone. He thought I was drowning. He thought I was begging for a lifeline. He didn't know that I was quietly building a submarine, and I was preparing to launch a torpedo straight at his worldview. The auditorium for the campus startup competition was packed. Investors, professors, and tech journalists filled the seats. When Matthew and I walked onto the stage to pitch our software, which we named Aegis Protocol, my hands were sweating so much I could barely hold the clicker for the presentation. But the moment I started talking about the architecture, the nervousness vanished. I knew the code. I knew it was flawless. We demonstrated a live simulation, hacking into a dummy server protected by standard enterprise security, bypassing it in 40 seconds. Then, we applied Aegis Protocol and invited the judges, professional penetration testers, to try and break in. They spent 10 minutes hammering our system. Nothing. It held like titanium. When they announced us as the winners of the $50,000 seed funding, the crowd erupted. Matthew tackled me in a massive hug. I held the giant novelty check, staring at the numbers. $50,000. To a kid eating instant ramen, it felt like all the money in the world. I stepped out into the hallway, my heart racing, and dialed my father's number. For a brief, foolish moment, a remnant of the little boy inside me thought that maybe, just maybe, this concrete proof of success would make him proud. "What is it?" his rough voice answered. "I'm in a meeting with the union reps." "Dad, I won?" I said, unable to hide the excitement in my voice. "My partner and I just won the university startup competition. We got $50,000 in seed funding for our software company. You don't have to pay for my tuition anymore. I can fund myself." There was a long silence on the line. I could hear the faint sounds of a construction site in the background. $50,000? He repeated. His tone wasn't proud. It was dripping with condescension. "You interrupt my work day to tell me you won a science fair? That's student pocket change, Elijah. It's a game." "It's not a game," I said, my voice hardening. "It's real seed money. It's a business." He laughed, that same mocking bark from my childhood. "You have no idea what business is. You don't have a product, you don't have a factory, you don't have hard assets. You have invisible air. If you think you're so independent now, fine. The gravy train stops today. I'm cutting off the tuition payments, I'm canceling your health insurance, and I'm taking you off the family phone plan. You want to play CEO? Let's see how long you survive when the real bills come due." He hung up, just like that. I lowered the phone. The joy of winning evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard reality. He hadn't just dismissed my success. He had used it as an excuse to completely abandon me. He wanted the pressure to crush me. I walked back into the auditorium, found Matthew, and held up the giant check. "We're not celebrating," I said, my voice dead serious. "We need an office, we need servers, and we need to incorporate. Today." We used the money to rent a terrible, windowless basement office in Cambridge. The roof leaked, the heating was broken, and the carpet smelled like old damp paper. But it was ours. We bought cheap, used servers and set up folding tables for desks. We were officially a company. My father had cut the final cord, thinking I would plummet to the ground. He didn't realize he had just given me the ultimate freedom to fly. The $50,000 vanished faster than I could have ever imagined. Running a legitimate tech startup burned through cash like a furnace. We had server costs, legal fees for incorporation, and basic software licenses. Within 6 months, our bank account was dangerously close to zero. We couldn't afford to pay ourselves a salary. We started pitching to venture capital firms in Boston, looking for our series of funding. We secured over 20 meetings. I bought a cheap suit from a thrift store, printed out our pitch deck, and walked into boardrooms with polished mahogany tables, facing men in custom suits who wore watches worth more than my entire company. The rejections were brutal and relentless. "The tech is interesting, but you're a college kid. You don't have the leadership experience to run an enterprise B2B company," one investor told me, checking his phone while I was still speaking. "Security requires trust. Why would a Fortune 500 bank trust a 20-year-old with their sensitive data?" Another sneered. We were running on fumes. Matthew and I were sleeping on the floor of the damp basement office under thin sleeping bags. We lived on peanut butter sandwiches and the cheapest coffee we could find. The stress was physically destroying me. I lost 15 pounds. I had dark, bruised-looking circles under my eyes. If I had been married, the stress would have been enough to cause a divorce. It was a suffocating, terrifying darkness. One night in November, the heat in the basement completely failed. The temperature dropped to near freezing. I was sitting at my desk, wrapped in a blanket, staring at a spreadsheet that clearly showed we had exactly 2 weeks of cash left before the servers would be shut off. My phone rang. It was my mother. I hadn't spoken to her in months. "Elijah?" Her voice was a fragile whisper. "Are you okay? You sound terrible." "I'm fine, Mom. Just working late." I lied, my teeth chattering slightly. "Wyatt told your father that you've been begging for money from investors and getting rejected everywhere," she said softly. "Elijah, please. Your father is in a good mood today. Carter just secured a big contract. If you call him now, apologize and admit you made a mistake, he'll let you come home. He told me he'd still give you the receptionist job. Please, honey, stop torturing yourself." I squeezed my eyes shut. The temptation to give up, to sleep in a warm bed, to eat a hot meal was a physical ache in my body. All I had to do was surrender. All I had to do was admit I was weak. I looked over at Matthew. He was shivering in his sleeping bag, hugging his laptop for warmth. He trusted me. He had bet his future on my vision. "No," I said, my voice cracking but firm. "I'm not coming home, Mom. And I'm not apologizing for trying to build something real. Elijah, you're going to ruin your life." "I have to go, Mom. Tell Wyatt to mind his own business." I hung up the phone. I stared at the black screen of my monitor. The desperation threatened to swallow me whole. But in that freezing basement, I made a vow. I would rather starve to death in this room than walk through the doors of my father's house as a defeated man. I opened the code editor and started typing. I was going to find a client. I was going to force the market to respect me. Our breakthrough came in the form of a mid-sized regional bank. Desperate for a cheaper security alternative after a minor data breach, their chief technology officer took a massive risk and agreed to a pilot program using Aegis protocol. It was our lifeline. The contract was small, but it provided enough revenue to keep the lights on and the servers running. For exactly 3 weeks, we were breathing again. Then the nightmare started. It was 2 a.m. on a Thursday. I was asleep on the office couch when the emergency alarms on my laptop started screaming. I jolted awake, my heart hammering against my ribs. Matthew was already at his terminal, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "We've got a massive spike in traffic," Matthew shouted over the alarms. "Someone is trying a brute force attack on the bank's external servers. They're hitting the exact firewall vulnerabilities we patched last week." "How do they know where to hit?" I demanded, pulling up the traffic logs. "Those patch locations are proprietary." "I don't know, but they're aggressive. They're trying to flood the system to mask a data extraction." We fought the attack in real time. For 4 agonizing hours, it was digital hand-to-hand combat. We scrambled IP addresses, erected phantom servers to distract the bots, and constantly shifted the encryption keys. Finally, right as the sun started to rise, the attack stopped. Our shields had held. No client data was breached. But the reality of the situation chilled my blood. The attackers hadn't just been guessing. They had a map of our system's architecture. Someone had leaked our structural data. I spent the next 48 hours doing forensic tracing. I didn't sleep. I tracked the digital breadcrumbs of the attack, unspooling the fake IP addresses and proxy servers the hackers had used. It took me deep into the dark web, tracing cryptocurrency payments used to rent the botnet. Finally, I found the origin node. It traced back to a corporate server owned by Apex Security, a rival cybersecurity firm headed by a ruthless CEO named Cameron. Cameron had lost the bank contract to us and was clearly trying to stage a breach to ruin our reputation. But how did Cameron get the architecture map? I dug deeper into the email logs and server access histories. I found a single unauthorized download of a PDF containing our system overview. I traced the IP address of the download. The numbers appeared on my screen, and I stopped breathing. I knew that IP address. I had set up the router for it myself 3 years ago. It was the IP address for the Anderson Building Supply corporate headquarters. I sat back in my chair, sick to my stomach. I hacked into my family's own poorly secured company server, bypassing the rudimentary passwords in seconds. I accessed Wyatt's corporate email account, and there it was, an email chain between Wyatt and Cameron. Wyatt had met Cameron at a high-end country club bar. Wyatt, eager to sound important and to mock his failure of a little brother, had bragged about my company. He had even forwarded a pitch deck I had sent to my mother months ago, a deck that contained sensitive architectural diagrams. Carter was copied on the email, adding a reply, "Take the kid out. Show him how the real sharks swim." My own brothers, my own flesh and blood, out of petty jealousy and a desire to see my father's prophecy of my failure come true, they had casually handed a loaded gun to my enemy. They had tried to destroy everything I had bled for, just for a laugh over expensive cocktails. I clenched my fists until my knuckles turned white. The pain of the betrayal was brief. It was instantly incinerated by a rage so pure and focused. It felt like a physical heat radiating from my skin. They wanted to play with the sharks? Fine. I was going to show them exactly what a predator looked like. I didn't call my brothers. I didn't scream or throw things. I operated with the cold, surgical precision of a machine. I compiled every piece of forensic evidence linking the cyber attack to Apex Security. I had the server logs, the proxy traces, and the emails between Cameron and Wyatt. I organized it all into a single, devastating digital dossier. Then, I found out where Cameron was having lunch. It was a high-end steakhouse in the financial district. I put on my cheap suit, walked into the restaurant, and found him sitting in a leather booth, cutting into a rare ribeye. I slid into the booth opposite him. He looked up, annoyed. "Who the hell are you? This is a private table." "My name is Elijah Anderson. I'm the CEO of Aegis Protocol," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low. Cameron's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered, leaning back with an arrogant smile. "Ah, the college kid. I heard your little startup was having some server instability issues last night. Rough business, kid. You should leave it to the professionals." I pulled a sleek black USB drive from my pocket and placed it on the white tablecloth next to his water glass. "I'm not here to play games, Cameron," I said, leaning in. "On that drive is the complete forensic trail proving you orchestrated a felony cyber attack on a financial institution. I also have the emails between you and my idiot brothers. It proves corporate espionage, malicious hacking, and wire fraud." The color drained entirely from his face. His fork clattered onto his plate. "You're bluffing. You can't prove anything. I'm a better engineer in my sleep than your entire IT department is on their best day," I replied smoothly. "Here is what is going to happen. You are going to back off. You are never going to bid against my company again. If I so much as see a strange ping on my servers from your region, I will hand this drive over to a federal cybercrimes lawyer. You won't just lose your company. You'll go to federal prison. Do you understand me?" He stared at me, his arrogance shattered. He swallowed hard and gave a stiff, almost imperceptible nod. I stood up, adjusting my cheap jacket. "Enjoy your steak." Walking out of that restaurant, the adrenaline surging through my veins was intoxicating. I had taken a massive hit, and instead of folding, I had destroyed the threat. But the universe wasn't done playing its hand. Word of how I had completely outmaneuvered a major player like Apex Security spread quietly through the Boston tech underground. 2 days later, my phone rang. It was Aaron, a senior partner at one of the most ruthless and successful venture capital firms in the city. He didn't want a pitch deck. He wanted a meeting. I walked into his massive corner office overlooking the harbor. Aaron was older, sharp-eyed, and didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I heard what you did to Cameron," Aaron said, pouring 2 glasses of sparkling water. "It was vicious. It was legally dangerous. And it was brilliant. He attacked my company, I said simply. I neutralized the threat. Aaron smiled, showing perfectly white teeth. Most 20-year-olds would have cried and called the police. You went for the jugular. I like that. Your tech is phenomenal, but I don't invest in tech. I invest in killers. You proved you can bleed and bite back. He slid a contract across the desk. I'm offering you $500,000 in seed funding for a 15% equity stake. But there's a condition. I looked at the numbers. It was the lifeline we had been dying for. What's the condition? You have to become completely cold-blooded, Aaron said, leaning forward. No sentimentality, no hesitation. You scale this company aggressively, and you crush anyone in your way. Family, friends, competitors, it doesn't matter. Business is war. I thought of my father laughing at my code. I thought of Wyatt and Carter trying to destroy me over a martini. The last ounce of boyish innocence inside me burned away, leaving only iron. Where do I sign? I asked. The war had officially begun, and I was finally heavily armed. The next 3 years were a blur of hypergrowth. With Aaron's funding and mentorship, Aegis Protocol mutated from a struggling startup in a leaky basement into an apex predator in the cybersecurity sector. We moved out of the basement and into a sleek, glass-walled office space in the Seaport district. We went from 2 employees to 200. I didn't just grow the company, I transformed myself. I traded the cheap thrift store suits for custom tailoring. I learned how to read financial sheets, how to negotiate brutal contracts, and how to command a boardroom of executives who were twice my age. I stopped being Elijah the disappointment. I became Elijah the CEO. As we scaled, the complexity of the business outgrew my operational experience. That's when I hired Julian. Julian was a 60-year-old veteran of Wall Street, a sharp, distinguished man who had taken 3 different tech companies public. He became my chief financial officer, but in reality, he was the father figure I had never had in the business world. He didn't belittle my ideas. He refined them. He didn't demand obedience. He demanded excellence. You have the vision, Elijah, Julian told me during our first late-night strategy session. My job is to build the financial fortress around that vision so nobody can ever tear it down. When we finally landed our first Fortune 500 client, a major international logistics firm, it felt like we had crossed the Rubicon. We were no longer a scrappy startup. We were an enterprise powerhouse. Against my better judgment, I decided to call my father. It had been years since we had spoken. Part of me, a stubborn, lingering piece of trauma, still wanted to hear him say he was wrong. He answered on the 3rd ring. Robert Anderson. Dad, it's Elijah. A pause. Well, look who decided to call. Did you finally go bankrupt? Is the receptionist's desk looking good to you now? I closed my eyes, taking a slow breath. No, I'm calling because my company just signed a multi-million-dollar enterprise contract with a Fortune 500 logistics firm. We have 200 employees, Dad. We're generating serious revenue. He let out a dismissive scoff. Tech bubble garbage. It's all fake money, Elijah. Silicon Valley fairy dust. Just wait until the market corrects. You're building a house on sand. You don't have hard assets. It's not a real business. Don't call me when your little house of cards collapses. He hung up. I stood in my corner office, looking out at the Boston skyline. The phone was silent in my hand. But this time I didn't feel the sting of rejection. I didn't feel the crushing need for his approval. I felt absolutely nothing for him. He was a dinosaur, clinging to an outdated worldview, completely blind to the meteor that was hurtling toward him. The desire for a traditional promotion in a family business, the craving for a father's validation, all of it evaporated. I didn't need him to admit I was right. I was going to let the global financial market do the talking for me. It was Julian who brought the idea to the table. We were sitting in the boardroom, reviewing our explosive year-over-year revenue growth. We're ready, Julian said softly, sliding a thick blue folder across the table toward me. The market conditions are perfect. The sector is hungry for a dominant security player. It's time to take Aegis Protocol public. I stared at the folder. Inside was the draft of an S-1 document, the registration form required by the Securities and Exchange Commission for an initial public offering, IPO. This wasn't just raising venture capital. This was listing the company on the stock exchange. This was the big leagues. Are we strong enough to survive the scrutiny? I asked, feeling the weight of the decision. Taking custody of a public company meant answering to thousands of shareholders. It meant extreme transparency. Our financials are bulletproof, Julian assured me with a confident smile. And your narrative is compelling. The brilliant founder who built a fortress from a dorm room. The underwriters are already drooling. If we price it right, we could hit a unicorn valuation on day one. A unicorn, $1 billion company. The number was so massive it almost felt abstract. We initiated the process in absolute, suffocating secrecy. Only the executive board and our lead underwriters knew. For 6 months, I lived a double life. By day, I was running the company and finalizing my long-delayed degree requirements at MIT. I had kept taking one class a semester, refusing to officially drop out just to spite my father's prediction. By night, I was locked in conference rooms with lawyers and investment bankers, scrutinizing every comma in the S-1 filing. The pressure was unimaginable. If word leaked too early, it could ruin the valuation. We operated under strict non-disclosure agreements. My family naturally knew absolutely nothing. To them, I was still just playing with computers in Boston. As the dates began to solidify, I realized a cosmic irony was unfolding. The SEC approval timeline, the roadshow with institutional investors, and the final pricing night. All of it was perfectly aligning with the second week of May. The exact same week as my MIT graduation ceremony. It was almost poetic. 5 years ago, my father had threatened to cut off my college fund and force me into submission. Now, in the exact same week I would receive the degree he said I would never earn, I was going to ring the bell on a $1 billion public offering. The night before graduation, I was sitting in my apartment, staring at the black gown hanging on the door. My phone rang. It was Julian. "The institutional books are closed," Julian said, his voice trembling slightly with suppressed excitement. "The demand is astronomical, Elijah. We are oversubscribed by 10 times. We're finalizing the opening share price tonight. I'll have the exact valuation for you by tomorrow morning." "When tomorrow morning?" I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. "Right around 10 a.m., Julian replied. "Right when the market opens. Right when I would be walking across the stage to get my diploma." I hung up the phone and looked out the window into the dark city. The storm I had been brewing for years was finally ready to make landfall. Tomorrow, the world would know who Elijah Anderson really was. And my father was going to have a front row seat to his own obsolescence. The morning of my graduation dawned with a crisp, cloudless blue sky over Boston. The air off the Charles River was sharp and clean. For most of the students putting on their black robes that morning, this day represented the terrifying beginning of their adult lives. They were worried about finding a job, paying off their student loans, and securing an entry-level salary that would let them afford a cramped apartment. For me, the stakes were entirely different. I was already running a massive enterprise. I stood in my modest apartment, adjusting the collar of a custom-tailored charcoal suit that cost more than my father's first truck. I slipped the cheap, rented graduation gown over my shoulders. The contrast made me smile. It was the perfect disguise. I arrived at the main campus courtyard around 8 in the morning. The sprawling green lawns were already packed with folding chairs, staging areas, and nervous families holding cameras and oversized bouquets of flowers. I walked through the crowd, my secure company phone buzzing silently in my inner suit pocket every few minutes. My executive team, led by Julian, was locked in our downtown boardroom with the investment bankers. Wall Street was waking up, and the final institutional orders for our IPO were being locked in. The financial world was buzzing about Aegis Protocol. And then I saw my family. They stood out like a sore thumb among the joyful, weeping parents hugging their children. My father, Robert, stood near the edge of the seating area, his arms tightly crossed over his broad chest. He wore a stiff, dark suit and a heavy gold Rolex that caught the morning sun. He was actively scowling at the historic buildings around us, as if the very concept of higher education offended his rugged sensibilities. My mother, Eleanor, stood half a step behind him, nervously clutching a small digital camera. My two brothers, Carter and Wyatt, flanked our father like bodyguards. Carter was loudly chewing gum, looking incredibly bored, while Wyatt was busy checking his own phone, completely disinterested in the ceremony. I took a deep breath and walked over to them. I owed them the courtesy of a greeting, if only to fulfill the final social obligation of my childhood. "Good morning," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. My father didn't uncross his arms. He looked me up and down, taking in the black gown and the square mortarboard cap. His lip curled into a visible sneer. "So, you finally managed to finish. 5 years part-time. Most men would have cut their losses and gotten a real job by now." "It takes time to build something of value," I replied, my tone neutral. I refused to let him bait me. "Not today." Carter let out a loud, obnoxious laugh. "Yeah, I'm sure fixing hard drives in the school library takes a lot of intense focus, little brother. Dad just closed a massive commercial development deal yesterday. That's real value. Maybe he'll let you run the cables for the new office building if you ask nicely." Wyatt didn't even look up from his screen. "Don't overwhelm the kid, Carter. He's got a big day of walking across a stage. It's the highlight of his life." My mother finally stepped forward, offering a weak, trembling smile. "You look very handsome, Elijah. We're glad to be here." She glanced nervously at my father, terrified that her mild compliment might trigger an outburst. My father simply checked his heavy watch and sighed loudly. "Let's get this over with. I have a flight back tonight. I can't afford to waste an entire Monday watching a bunch of kids get pieces of paper." I looked at the man who had spent his entire life trying to break me. I looked at the brothers who had actively conspired to destroy my company. I didn't feel anger anymore. I just felt a profound, overwhelming sense of pity. They were trapped in a tiny, arrogant bubble, entirely unaware that the world had already passed them by. "I have to go line up with the engineering school," I said, turning away. "Take your seats. It's going to be an interesting morning." As I walked away toward the staging tents, I reached inside my suit jacket and touched the cold metal of my secure phone. The opening bell on the New York Stock Exchange was exactly 30 minutes away. The trap was set. All I had to do was walk the stage. The graduation procession began with a grand, sweeping orchestral march. Thousands of us filed into the massive outdoor seating area, a sea of black gowns and colorful academic hoods. I found my seat in the engineering section, sitting between a brilliant aerospace student going to work for NASA and a mechanical engineer heading to a major automotive firm. They were buzzing with nervous energy. I sat perfectly still, my eyes fixed on the massive stage at the front. The ceremony dragged on with agonizing slowness. There were speeches from the university president, a guest commencement address from a famous politician, and endless remarks about changing the world and overcoming adversity. I tuned most of it out. My focus was split into two distinct realities. In the physical world, I was sitting under the Boston sun, waiting for my name to be called. In the digital world, I knew my company's ticker symbol had just gone live on the public exchange. At exactly 9:45 a.m., the dean of the engineering school stepped up to the podium and began calling names. The process was alphabetical. Anderson was going to be called very early. The students in my row stood up and began filing toward the side of the stage. My heart beat with a slow, heavy rhythm. As I reached the bottom of the wooden stairs leading up to the platform, I felt a sharp vibration against my right thigh. It was my personal cell phone, the one my family had the number for. I paused on the grass, right before stepping onto the stairs. I reached into my pocket and pulled the phone out. The screen lit up with a new text message. The sender was listed simply as Robert. I opened the message. "Don't expect any help. You're on your own, boy. The college fund is gone. You made your bed. now lie in it. He couldn't help himself. He couldn't let me have even a single hour of uninterrupted accomplishment. He had to reach out and try to crush my spirit right before I walked across that stage. He wanted to make sure I felt the full, devastating weight of his financial and emotional abandonment. He wanted me to look out into the crowd and know that the man who was supposed to be my greatest protector was actually my most vicious enemy. For a man obsessed with traditional strength, it was an incredibly cowardly act. He sent a text message because he didn't have the courage to look me in the eye and say it to my face. I looked at the glowing words on the screen. A few years ago, a message like this would have shattered me. It would have sent me into a spiral of depression and self-doubt. It would have made me question every choice I had ever made. But standing there at the base of the stage, I felt nothing but a cold, hard clarity. The last, microscopic thread of hope I had that my father might one day love me snapped. And in its place, an unbreakable armor forged of absolute self-reliance formed around my chest. I didn't reply. I didn't delete it. I simply locked the screen and slid the phone back into my pocket. Elijah Anderson. The dean's voice boomed over the massive stadium speakers. Bachelor of Science in Computer Science and Engineering. I stepped onto the wooden stage. I didn't look down. I didn't slouch. I walked with the posture of a man who owned the ground he walked on. I crossed the stage, shook the dean's hand, and accepted the leather-bound diploma folder. I turned to face the photographer, gave a sharp, confident smile, and the flash went off. I looked out into the crowd, scanning the VIP family section. I found them. My father was sitting with his arms crossed, his face a mask of bitter resentment. He was waiting for me to look defeated. He was waiting for the reality of his text message to crush me. I held the diploma in my left hand, looked directly into my father's eyes across the distance of the courtyard, and gave him a slow, mocking salute. His jaw tightened, and he looked away in disgust. He thought he had won the war. He didn't know the battlefield was about to explode. I walked down the stairs on the opposite side of the stage. The moment my foot hit the grass, the secure phone in my inner breast pocket began to vibrate frantically. It wasn't a text. It was an incoming call from Julian. The market had been open for 15 minutes. The results were in. I stepped away from the line of returning graduates, moving toward a cluster of heavy audio equipment near the edge of the stage. The secure phone was practically burning a hole in my jacket. I pulled it out and answered, pressing it hard against my ear to drown out the applause of the crowd. "Julian," I said, my voice tight. "Tell me." "Elijah." Julian's voice was completely unhinged, lacking all his usual Wall Street composure. He was shouting over the sound of massive cheering in our boardroom. "It's a bloodbath in the best way possible. The institutional buyers went crazy. Retail investors are flooding the gates. The opening price blew past our highest estimates." "Give me the number, Julian," I demanded, gripping the phone. "We opened at $48 a share," Julian yelled, his voice cracking with emotion. "Do you understand what that means? The stock is surging. We just blew past a $1.1 billion market cap. You did it, kid. You're a billionaire. Aegis Protocol is officially a unicorn." $1 billion. $1.1 billion. The number hit my brain like a physical shockwave. I had spent years crunching the projections, dreaming of this exact outcome. But hearing the words spoken aloud made the reality crash down on me. I wasn't just a successful entrepreneur anymore. I was a titan in the industry. The wealth I now commanded eclipsed my father's entire construction empire by a factor of 10. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the Boston air. All the years of eating instant ramen, sleeping on basement floors, fighting off cyber attacks, and swallowing my family's relentless abuse rushed through my mind in a single second. "Lock down the internal communications," I said, my voice suddenly projecting loudly. I didn't care who heard me anymore. The secrecy was over. "Make sure the press release goes out to Bloomberg and CNBC immediately. I want the world to see the numbers." "It's already out, Elijah," Julian laughed. CNBC is breaking the story live right now. They're calling it the tech IPO of the year. Your face is flashing on terminal screens across the globe. I was standing directly next to a secondary speaker and a live microphone set up for the university band. I didn't realize how loud I was speaking, or perhaps, subconsciously, I did. "Perfect," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the immediate area. A $1.1 billion valuation on day one. Tell the board I'll be at the headquarters for the press conference as soon as I drop this graduation gown. I hung up the phone. I turned around and realized that an entire section of graduates, parents, and faculty members standing near the audio equipment were staring at me in dead silence. "Did he just say $1 billion?" A mother in the front row whispered loudly to her husband. "That's Elijah Anderson," an engineering professor behind me said, his eyes wide. "He's the CEO of Aegis Protocol. I just got the news alert on my phone. Their IPO just broke the market." The whispers started instantly. They rippled outward from where I stood. A wave of shock and realization spreading through the crowd. Billionaire. Phil. Aegis Protocol. That student right there. I ignored them all. I turned my eyes back to Section C, where my family was sitting. My father was no longer looking at the stage. He was staring down at his smartphone. The major financial news networks push breaking alerts to anyone tracking the markets. As a businessman, Robert always had his alerts turned on. I watched the exact sequence of events play out on his face. I watched him read the headline, "Aegis Protocol, founded by 28-year-old MIT student Elijah Anderson, hits $1.1 billion valuation in blockbuster IPO." The heavy, arrogant mask my father had worn for my entire life shattered into a million pieces. His face drained of all color, turning a sickly, ashen gray. His jaw literally dropped open. He looked up from his screen, his eyes wildly searching the crowd until they locked onto me. He looked at me, the son he had just texted to abandon, the son he had called a weak disappointment, the son he had forced to use a broken laptop. He looked at me, and for the first time in his life he didn't see a victim. He saw a king. His hands began to shake so badly he nearly dropped his phone. Carter and Wyatt were leaning over his shoulder, reading the screen. Carter's mouth was hanging open like a caught fish. Wyatt looked like he was going to be physically sick. I held his gaze across the sea of people. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just let him drown in the absolute, undeniable reality of his own colossal mistake. This is the moment that changes everything, the moment I finally took back control of my life. Thank you so much for your patience and for staying with me until now. You've been amazing. Please give this video a like and comment one below to let me know you've made it this far. Not only does this help more people find this story, but it also lets me know that my experiences truly mean something to someone. Your support is my greatest motivation to keep sharing the rest of this journey. The graduation ceremony eventually concluded, but the atmosphere had irrevocably changed. As we filed out of the seating area, I was no longer an anonymous student. People were pointing at me. A reporter from a local Boston paper, who was covering the graduation for a human interest piece, suddenly shoved a recorder in my face, shouting questions about the stock price. I politely pushed past him, flanked by two campus security guards who had quickly realized they needed to give me an escort. My family and I had agreed weeks ago to meet for a celebration lunch at Harvest, one of the most exclusive and expensive restaurants in Cambridge. It was a reservation my mother had practically begged my father to keep. I arrived at the restaurant before them, shedding the graduation gown and leaving it in the trunk of the car. I walked into the elegant, wood-paneled foyer wearing my tailored suit. The maitre d', a polished man in his 50s, took one look at me and his eyes widened in recognition. He had a tablet in his hand showing the financial news. "Mr. Anderson," he said, bowing his head slightly with deep respect. "Congratulations on a truly historic morning. It is an absolute honor to have you dine with us today. Your private dining room is ready." 10 minutes later, my family walked through the heavy glass doors. They looked like they had just survived a car crash. My father's face was rigid, his eyes bloodshot. Carter looked terrified, and Wyatt wouldn't make eye contact with anyone. My mother just looked incredibly confused. The maitre d' greeted them smoothly. "Right this way, please. Billionaire Anderson is waiting for you in the private suite." My father flinched as if he had been physically slapped. The word billionaire hitting his ears in public was agonizing for him. We sat down at a round mahogany table in a secluded room. The silence was suffocating. The waiter poured expensive sparkling water and quietly retreated, sensing the explosive tension in the air. My father gripped the edge of the linen tablecloth. His knuckles turned completely white. A thick blue vein throbbed near his temple. He couldn't handle the shift in power. He needed to drag me back down to his level. "You set this up," he hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and profound humiliation. "You kept this a secret for years just to ambush me today. You orchestrated this whole media circus to make me look like a fool in front of my own family. You wanted to humiliate this family." I reached into my leather briefcase, pulled out my MIT diploma, and dropped it onto the center of the table. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. "I didn't orchestrate the stock market, Robert," I said. "I dropped the title Dad. He didn't deserve it anymore. I built a software empire. It took 5 years of 80-hour weeks, surviving cyber attacks orchestrated by your own golden children, and sleeping on basement floors. I built all of this while you were actively praying for my failure." My mother gasped, covering her mouth. "Elijah, what do you mean, cyber attacks?" I looked directly at Wyatt. "Why don't you tell her, Wyatt? Why don't you tell Mom how you and Carter leaked my proprietary server architecture to a rival firm because you were jealous I got a client? You committed federal corporate espionage. If I had handed the evidence to the FBI, both of you would be wearing orange jumpsuits right now." Wyatt turned the color of ash. He stared at his plate, completely paralyzed. Carter swallowed hard, his tough guy facade entirely crumbling. My father looked at my brothers, then back at me. His mind couldn't process the reality. "You're lying. You're just trying to tear this family apart with your new tech money." "I don't need to tear this family apart," I said, my voice dropping to a low, deadly calm. "It was broken the day you decided my worth was based on how well I could swing a hammer. You sent me a text right before I walked the stage today. Do you remember what it said? You told me I was on my own. You told me the college fund was gone and I shouldn't expect any help." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. "You were right, Robert. I am on my own. And from the day I left your house, that has been the greatest advantage I ever had." The room fell into an agonizing, deadly silence. My father opened his mouth to speak, to launch another defense of his ego, but no words came out. For a man who had dominated every conversation for his entire life, the inability to control the narrative was destroying him from the inside out. He looked at the diploma on the table. He looked at my suit. He looked at the hard, unforgiving expression on my face. He finally realized the brutal truth. He had absolutely nothing I wanted, and absolutely nothing I needed. His money, his approval, his legacy, they were all worthless to me now. "Elijah, please," my mother whispered, tears finally spilling over her cheeks. "We're a family. We can fix this. Your father, he just doesn't understand your world." "He understands power, Mom," I said gently to her. "And he's angry because he doesn't have it over me anymore." My phone vibrated on the table. It was a message from Julian. The press conference at the headquarters was set up. The financial media was waiting. I had a company to run. I stood up, buttoning my suit jacket. "Where are you going?" Carter asked, his voice suddenly sounding very small, like a frightened child. "We haven't even ordered lunch." "I have responsibilities, Carter," I said. "Shareholders, employees, and board members. People who actually rely on me." I looked down at my father one last time. He was staring at the tablecloth, utterly defeated. The massive, terrifying giant of my childhood had shrunk into a bitter, aging man sitting in a restaurant chair. Felt like watching a funeral for a monster. "If you ever need to speak to me again, I said, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. Don't call my personal number. Call my corporate office and make an appointment with my executive assistant. If it's a legal matter regarding my brother's previous actions, you can direct it to my corporate lawyer. I picked up my diploma, turned on my heel, and walked out of the private room. I didn't look back. I walked out of the restaurant and stepped into the bright afternoon sunlight. Pulling up to the curb was a massive, sleek black town car that Julian had dispatched for me. The driver, wearing a sharp suit, quickly stepped out and opened the rear door. Congratulations on a phenomenal day, Mr. Anderson, the driver said warmly. Thank you, I replied. I slid into the plush leather seat, the heavy door closing behind me with a solid, expensive thud. The car pulled away from the curb, merging into the Boston traffic. I looked out the tinted window at the Charles River glittering in the sun. I took a deep breath, and for the first time in 28 years, the air didn't feel heavy. I wasn't carrying the weight of my father's expectations anymore. I was finally truly free. The month following the IPO was a whirlwind of absolute chaos and incredible momentum. Aegis Protocol stock stabilized at an even higher premium than our opening day. My net worth officially crossed the $300 million mark on paper. I moved out of my cramped apartment and bought a penthouse overlooking the harbor. I raised my employee salaries, gave massive bonuses to the core engineering team, and finally started sleeping more than 4 hours a night. I had won the war. But karma, as they say, has a spectacular sense of timing. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting in my corner office, reviewing a potential acquisition deal, when my executive assistant buzzed my intercom. Mr. Anderson, your brother Wyatt is on line 1. He says it's an absolute emergency. He sounds frantic. I raised an eyebrow. I hadn't spoken to a single member of my family since walking out of the restaurant. I pressed the speaker button. Elijah speaking. Elijah. Oh, thank God you answered. Wyatt's voice blared through the speaker. He was hyperventilating, completely panicked. It was a shocking contrast to his usual arrogant sneer. What do you want, Wyatt? Make it quick. We're going under, Elijah. The company, Anderson Building Supply. We're on the verge of declaring bankruptcy. I paused, leaning back in my chair. That's impossible. Dad's company is a regional powerhouse. He has hard assets, real business. Remember, it was Carter, Wyatt sobbed, the sound pathetic and desperate. Dad gave him full control of the commercial development division 2 years ago. Carter bet everything on a massive luxury condo project. But he didn't secure the zoning permits correctly. The city shut the project down. We're holding millions in toxic debt, and the supply chain collapsed. We can't make payroll next week. I stared at the Boston skyline. The golden child had driven the Porsche straight into a brick wall. It was predictable, but the speed of the collapse was staggering. That sounds like a terrible management issue, I said coldly. Why are you calling me? Because it gets worse? Wyatt choked out. When Dad saw your company going public, when he saw the numbers on the news alert that morning at graduation, he snapped. He couldn't handle the fact that you beat him. He thought he could ride your success to cover Carter's losses. I sat forward, my blood running cold. What did he do? He took out a massive secret mortgage against the family estate. Wyatt confessed, his voice dropping to a whisper. He drained his retirement accounts. He used all the liquid cash the company had left. And on the morning of your IPO, he called his broker and put everything into buying shares of Aegis Protocol at the peak retail price. I let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. The absolute, staggering hypocrisy of the man. For years, he had mocked me, calling my company fairy dust and fake tech money. He had literally sent me a text disowning me. But the second he saw the billion-dollar valuation, he secretly bet his entire life savings on my genius just to save his own sinking ship. The stock stabilized, but it dipped slightly from the opening day high, Wyatt continued, crying. He bought at the absolute top. He's underwater on the margin call. The bank is foreclosing on the house. Elijah. Dad is facing total ruin. The man who had promised I would come crawling back for a receptionist job was now standing on the edge of the abyss, and I was holding the only rope. I didn't offer Wyatt any comfort. I simply hung up the phone. I wasn't going to be dragged into the emotional wreckage of their bad decisions. However, 2 days later, the official plea arrived. It wasn't a phone call. It was a highly formal email sent directly to my corporate address, CCing my legal team. The sender was Robert Anderson. I opened the email on my massive monitor. It read, Elijah, given the current macroeconomic challenges facing the construction sector, Anderson Building Supply is undergoing a strategic realignment. As a family business, it is vital that we pool our resources. I am formally offering you a seat on the board of directors of our firm. Your newfound expertise in public markets and capital allocation would be a valuable asset in restructuring our debt. We can discuss the transfer of capital from your accounts to stabilize the firm at a board meeting this Friday. We expect to see you there. I read the email 3 times. I was utterly astounded by the sheer, unadulterated arrogance of it. Even facing total financial annihilation, he couldn't bring himself to apologize. He couldn't say, I was wrong about you. He couldn't ask for help like a normal human being. Instead, he framed it as an offer. He was demanding that I use the money I bled for to bail out the empire he had built for the sons he actually loved. He was trying to order me around one last time. I typed my reply carefully. I didn't use profanity. I didn't use exclamation points. I used the deadliest weapon I possessed: absolute corporate indifference. Robert, thank you for the offer to join the board of Anderson Building Supply. However, I must decline. My fiduciary duties as CEO of Aegis Protocol require my undivided attention, and I do not invest capital in failing ventures with a history of severe executive mismanagement. Given your current liquidity crisis, I highly recommend contacting the restructuring firm of Harrison & Cole. They specialize in corporate bankruptcy and asset liquidation. They will ensure your remaining assets are sold off efficiently to pay your creditors. Do not contact my office regarding this matter again. Regards, Elijah Anderson. I hit send. With that single click, I severed the final, rotting chain that bound me to my past. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel malicious. I felt an incredible, profound peace. I had let them destroy themselves with their own arrogance. The collapse of my father's empire was rapid and quiet. They sold the business for parts to a larger competitor. The family estate was auctioned off. Carter ended up working as a mid-level shift manager at a hardware store, and Wyatt moved to another state to sell insurance. My father retired to a small condo, his power stripped, his legacy erased. But I didn't want my story to be solely defined by the destruction of my father. I wanted my legacy to be about creation. 3 months after the IPO, I called a press conference. Standing in the atrium of our new headquarters, I announced the creation of the Aegis Future Fund. I took $50 million of my personal stock options and placed them into a trust. The fund had one specific purpose: providing massive, no-strings-attached seed grants and full-ride university scholarships to young entrepreneurs who had been cut off financially by their families for pursuing their passions. It was the college fund my father had ripped away from me, multiplied by 1,000, given to the kids who needed it most. The very first recipient was a 19-year-old kid named Leo from a rural farming town in Ohio. His parents had literally packed his bags and locked him out of the house because he wanted to study artificial intelligence instead of taking over the family's soybean farm. He had been sleeping in his old car, trying to code on a cracked tablet. I insisted on making the phone call to Leo myself. "Leo," I said, sitting in my quiet office overlooking the city. "This is Elijah Anderson. We've reviewed your application and the code you submitted. It's brilliant." "Mr. Anderson?" Leo's voice was shaking. "Thank you. I've been trying so hard, sir. But I'm out of money. I don't think I can keep doing this." "You don't have to worry about the money anymore, Leo," I said softly. "The Future Fund is granting you $200,000 in seed capital, and we are covering your full tuition at the engineering school of your choice. You're not on your own anymore." There was a long silence on the line. And then, I heard a sound that broke my heart and healed it all at once. Leo began to sob. Deep, heavy, chest-heaving sobs of absolute relief. The sound of a kid who had been bracing for a massive blow, only to be caught by a safety net. "Thank you," he cried. "My dad said I was useless. He said I'd starve. Thank you for believing in me." "Your dad was wrong," I told him, tears prickling the corners of my own eyes. "Now go build something incredible and prove it to yourself." Hanging up the phone that day, I realized something profound. For years, the gaping wound in my chest caused by my father's rejection had driven me to succeed. But hearing Leo's voice, I felt that wound finally, permanently close. I had taken the poison my family fed me and turned it into the cure for someone else. Exactly 1 year after my graduation, I walked back onto the campus of MIT. I wasn't there as a struggling student hiding a secret company. I was there as a guest lecturer, invited by Professor David to speak to the graduating class of the engineering school. The auditorium was packed to the rafters. Hundreds of eager, brilliant students looked down at me from the tiered seating. I told them the truth about my journey. I didn't sugarcoat the rejections, the sleepless nights, or the brutal reality of dealing with toxic family dynamics in the pursuit of greatness. During the Q&A session at the end, a young woman near the front row raised her hand. She looked nervous but determined. I paused, letting the words sink in. If you are waiting for the people who hurt you to validate your success, you are giving them the keys to your happiness. True success isn't about proving your haters wrong. True success is about proving yourself right. It's about looking in the mirror and knowing that you survived the storm, and that you built a ship strong enough to sail anywhere you want to go. The auditorium erupted into thunderous applause. I walked off the stage, shook hands with the professor, and stepped out into the bright Boston afternoon. I looked up at the sky, breathing in the fresh air. I was Elijah Anderson. I was the architect of my own destiny, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly where I was going. Thank you for sticking around and listening to my story. Writing this and sharing it with you all has been an incredible journey of healing for me. I hope this resonated with you in some way, whether you're building a business, studying for a degree, or just trying to survive a toxic environment. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation, having to cut ties with the people who were supposed to support you in order to find your own success? I'd love to read your stories in the comments below. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, you are officially part of the 1% Club. I want you to comment the letter W down below. W stands for winner. It's our secret code to recognize the incredible, resilient people who have the attention span and the heart to stick with a story until the very end. Please don't forget to hit that like button and follow the channel so we can continue to grow this amazing community. I'll see you all in the next story. Stay strong and keep building your empire.